Welcome to the very first video from the biblical timeline. I chose to start with Kings and Chronicles, and the reason for that is that the reign of Solomon is really the anchor point for all earlier biblical chronology, and that will come up in future videos, and we'll talk through kind of why that is and what that means. But at this point, it's very important to get that particular date correct, and to do that, we have to work our way back through the other kings to nail down the dates for Solomon's reign. And the basis for this, the basis for what you see in the biblical timeline is a set of regnal dates developed by a guy named Edwin Thiele, or Thiele. And he first published his work as a doctoral thesis in a journal in 1944, and then I think a few years later with a book, the last edition of which was published in 1983. It's called The Mysterious Numbers of the Hebrew Kings. Here's a quote from Thiele. Chronology is the backbone of history. Without exact chronology, there can be no exact history. Until a correct chronology of a nation has been established, the events of that nation cannot be correctly integrated into the events of neighboring states. Thiele was very big on making sure that his chronology lined up with what we knew in terms of Assyria, but also Babylon and Egypt. Some of the earlier chronologies, most famously that of Ussher, did not have the benefit of archaeology. And what you'll see is that Thiele's dates for Solomon are about 45 years later than what Ussher had come to, as also some other earlier chronologists. So Thiele's work is really the mainstream set of numbers. I think it's the most widely accepted at this point. A lot of scholarship here, and because it does tie out very neatly with that of the neighboring kingdoms, it's really the standard. At this point. There are other proposals obviously out there and various views, but this is really what I would call the mainstream view. A lot of what is done here relies on what we call synchronisms. And a synchronism is, here's a very good example from Luke, something like this. We have the first verse there, in the days of Herod the king of Judea, relates to the birth of John the Baptist, and we know Jesus was born 6 months later. Second part here came to pass in the days of Caesar Augustus, and then there's also a reference to Quirinius as governor of Syria. So you kind of have three people. Now the problem with this one is that Quirinius was not governor of Syria until after Herod was dead. So this particular synchronism creates some issues, and there are various solutions to this. I won't go into those now. There's sort of a lot written about this, but that's not what we're talking about today. But this is essentially how dates were established in the ancient world. With the exception of Greece and Rome, most ancient civilizations did not reckon time from a fixed date. They would typically do it by the regnal years of the kings. So, you know, Herod the Great, you could say, hey, in the 10th year of Herod the Great, that would be 37 minus 10 would be 27 BC, and you could reckon a date that way. Or you would use synchronisms, as Luke has done, saying, hey, it was when Herod was the king and when Caesar Augustus was reigning and something else, and that would help you narrow it down to hopefully one or a very few number of years so that you had a narrow window in terms of that date. Thiele's very big on synchronisms, and he uses synchronisms with Assyria, Babylon, and Egypt as ways of establishing the dates and making sure that his chronology is solid and lines up with what's happening in the rest of the world. So lots of people had tried to solve this before Thiele, and the reason it's problematic is you have to understand a lot about what is going on in terms of how Israel and Judah, and actually also the other civilizations around them, how they actually reckoned dates and how they reckoned regnal years and the like. And if you don't understand this, then things just will not add up. So the first thing that Thiele identified was that Israel and Judah were using two different reckoning methods. Israel's year started on Nisan, which is in the spring. The Passover is on the 14th of Nisan, so think about it around Easter time. And Judah reckoned their dates from the civil new year, which was in the fall, so 6 months later, September, October. The other key thing was that Israel used non-ascension year dating, and Judah used ascension year dating, and we'll explain that here momentarily. So if we just look at the years, though, they don't line up. So what is late in year one for Judah would actually be the beginning of year two in Israel, and that's one way that you can get dates that don't quite work out. When we get into the regnal dates, so let's think about a couple of kings of Judah here. The first one begins to reign in year 1, dies in year 9, and is succeeded by king number 2. Ascension year dating basically means that you don't count the year that you come to the throne. So here, the first king, we don't count year 1. That's actually a year 0. It's what we call the ascension year. And the first year of that king actually begins on Tishri in year 2. And, second Tishri of year 3, and so on. When that king dies in his 8th year, in year 9, he's succeeded by the second king. And again, year 9 is not double counted here. It's year 0 of that second king. And then year 10 is year 1, and so on. Basic ascension year dating, there's no double counting of years. Each year only ever gets counted once in this system. On the contrary, if we look at Israel, let's take our first king here, comes to the throne at exactly the same time, but in the non-ascension system, that fractional first year is counted. So year 1 would be the sort of quarter year at the back end of year 1. First of Nisan in year 2 begins year 2 for that king. That king dies in year 4. Now what's interesting is what is that king's year 4 is only year 2 for the opposing king in Judah. So we're actually off by 2 years here because of the timing in the year when that change happens. If we put another king in that reigns, say, 3 years, again, we count, now you'll see we're counting year 4 twice. It's year 4 of the first king and year 1 of the second king. So there's a double count. And after that king has reigned 3 years, now this case he dies in the latter part of the year, so the year is already turned over in Judah and we're in year 5, but we're still off by 2 years. And what you'll see here is between these two systems, if you stacked up several reigns, every time you introduce a new king in Israel, you double count a year and you get off by 1 year on the Judah side. You can also get off based on the March versus September and where the transition actually takes place. So that's the first problem. This is complicated by the fact that the two kingdoms didn't consistently reckon their years in one system or the other. We believe that the United Kingdom used the ascension year reckoning, and that continued in Judah up until Athaliah, which she was the daughter of Ahab, so she came from Israel, would have been used to that system. And Thiele believed that she was responsible for changing Judah to the non-ascension year system, going back actually to her husband, Jehoram's reign, and then her son Ahaziah, and also to her to her grandson Joash, or son Joash. Maybe actually, I don't know, probably not her son, but in that same generation. So those 3 or 4 kings are counted in the non-ascension year reckoning. And then Judah switches back to ascension year reckoning, beginning with Amaziah and going on through to the end. Israel, on the other hand, consistently used non-ascension year reckoning up through Jehoahaz, and basically at the same time that Amaziah is coming to the throne, they switched. This is with Jehoash, and they used ascension year reckoning through to the end. So if things weren't confusing enough with the two systems, now you have actually the two kingdoms switching back and forth in terms of which one they're using. So that's kind of enough to make your head explode, but that is the basis for how Thiele gets to a lot of his dates. The other thing that he identified, the second problem, is what I'll call co-regencies and rival reigns. This comes right from a page in his book. On the Israel side, there's a very clear situation with Omri and Tibni where they're rivals. They're both reigning Israel and they're warring between the two, and Omri finally wins. But there's a period of overlap. Same kind of thing happens with Menahem and then his successor Pekahiah and Pekah. And that's referenced in Hosea 5:5, but not really in Kings or Chronicles. And then other than that, you have a bunch of co-regencies. So a co-regency would be where the king puts his son on the throne before he dies. And so now you're sort of double counting. So it might be year 10 of the king, but it's also now year 1 of his son. And then year 11 of the king is year 2 of the son, and so on. So you have this dual dating thing going on with these co-regencies. And typically the co-regencies would occur when there was some need or there's some uncertainty about the kingship. So in the case of Jehoash and Jeroboam II, hey, the king Jehoash is going off to fight a war. Let's put the son on the throne, make clear what the succession is, just in case I get killed in battle. On the Judah side, we have Asa. He has his disease in the feet, so he's ill. So he puts his son on the throne, gets his son some experience, and again, establishes the succession. We even have this going back to David and Solomon. David puts Solomon on the throne, at least briefly, before he dies, to make sure that the succession is established in the way that he wants it. And we'll see there's several other co-regencies. I will not go into the details of the whys and how we know. That would be a good place to delve into Thiele's book. But these are part of establishing the chronology, is understanding that these things are happening. So let's dig in. So here we have kind of a blank timeline. And what we're going to start with is there are 2 eclipses that are noted in Assyrian record. There's actually 6 that Thiele refers to, but these are really the critical ones. And they're recorded. We know that they occurred in the reign of a particular king and what year, sometimes even what month. And so what scientists have done is basically create a model of the solar system and on a computer and run that in reverse, so run it backwards and say, okay, well, when would we have had an eclipse that was visible from Nineveh? When would that have been? And can we line that up with these dates based on what we understand of who was reigning when? And so these 2 are really the foundational ones, 763 and 721. And from them, we can link back to the entire Neo-Assyrian period, sort of the last dynasty of Assyria. But this is the one that we're interested in. And this establishes and really locks in a lot of these dates. We know that the Assyrian Empire ended in 609. We'll talk about that in a bit. But this gives us the basics. Now, Assyria interacted a ton with Babylon. They basically ran Babylon in a number of places. So you'll see here there's some overlaps, or where from Tiglath-Pileser III through Ashurbanipal, basically Assyria is running Babylon, and there were actually a number of earlier times as well where they, at least Babylon, owed allegiance to Assyria or was somehow subject to them. So we can lay in the entire Babylonian timeline right up to the fall of Babylon in 539 and the rule of Cyrus. We can also use Ashurbanipal to lock in the late Egyptian timeline. So I've shown all of the kings, or most of the kings, of the 25th dynasty. The only one we're really absolutely sure about is Taharqa, the last one, who ruled from 690 to 664, because he was defeated by Ashurbanipal, who sacked Thebes. So we have a hard date where we can line up those 2 people in Egyptian history. And so the 26th dynasty, which follows, is very solid time-wise. After what you see is Psamtik III, Egypt gets conquered by the Persians, and so we know the Persian dynasty, and then ultimately by the Greeks, and we have the Ptolemaic dynasty right up to Cleopatra in the end. But so Egyptian history from 690 down is solid. I'm not going to show you what's before because there's some dispute, and I will come back to that at the end. So if we have this timeline, now we have a couple of key things. There are a couple of monuments in Assyria, one commemorating the Battle of Karkar in 853 BC. Now, in the list of kings that opposed Shalmaneser III in that battle, we find Ahab, king of Israel. So we know Ahab was alive in 853. There's something else known as the Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser III, which dates to 841, 12 years later, and that indicates that Jehu of Israel was paying tribute. So we know that Jehu must have been alive at that date. So those are really our anchor points if we're going to start developing the chronology of Israel and Judah. So we have Ahab, we have Judah. We know that they were alive in these respective years, that it's 12 years apart. We also know that there were 2 kings in between. Now the total regnal years is 2 for Ahaziah and 12 for Jehoram, or I'm sorry, 12 for Jehoram, for a total of 14 regnal years. But because we know Israel is using non-ascension year dating, we need to take away 2 double-counted years. So Ahaziah and Joram reigned for a total of 12 years, and we have a gap of 12 years. So the only way to make that work is that they exactly fit in that gap. What that means is that Ahab must have died in 853, was succeeded by Ahaziah, and that Joram must have died in 841 and was succeeded by Jehu. So now we have a very solid link here, and this is kind of unique because of that exact fit. Very often you get these things and you get some wiggle room. where, well, it could have been the last year, it could have been the second or the third, that kind of thing. But here it's pretty much exact. So we can nail this down. And so we can nail down the reigns of Ahab and Jehu at the same time based on those events. And we can put their predecessors and successors onto our timeline as well. Now remember, Tibni and Omri were rivals for a period, and then Omri was able to defeat him and reign solely, and he was the father of Ahab, the house of Omri. And in fact, even after that dynasty, if you will, has been wiped out, the Assyrians refer to Israel as the house of Omri. So you still see that. So they'll count Jehu and others as part of that house, even though they really weren't. So we've got this. Now we also know that in 841, when Jehu killed Joram, he also killed Ahaziah. And so we have a link, a very hard link to the end of Ahaziah's life and the beginning of Athaliah's reign. And that's our kind of starting point for the kings of Judah. Now you'll see here on everything that we do in the biblical timeline, things that are mentioned in the Bible, events and people, are in dark blue. The messianic line, however, is in purple. So you'll see Athaliah was not part of that line, whereas the other kings were. And so you'll see that purple running through all of the charts that we do. We can put in place also Joash. So we have a nice chunk of the middle of the two reigns all linked together, particularly at 841 with the transition from Joram to Jehu. So that's the beginning. This is the anchor point for our timeline, and it's solidly rooted in Assyrian history in the reign of Shalmaneser III. So if we work back from 841 BC, we can go back and add the rest of the kings of Israel, Elah, Baasha, Nadab, and Jeroboam I, and that gets us back to 931 BC. Now remember, we're taking off 1 year for each reign because of that double count, but that's how we get there. We can also look at Asa, at Abijah, and at Rehoboam, and recognizing the co-regency between Asa and Jehoshaphat at the very end, the last 2 years of his reign. That also gets us back to 931, so we can feel very comfortable then putting Solomon as ending his reign, and we'll say 930. As you know, the United Kingdom broke up with the coronation of Rehoboam. Jeroboam rebelled, and that was the beginning of the kingdom of Israel. So we can feel pretty comfortable that we've nailed down where Solomon is on this timeline. Now we should also kind of look, make sure we're counting things right. Now, in the case of Judah, we can just add up the dates, making sure we recognize the co-regencies, although we do have the last two kings are in that non-ascension year reckoning, so we have 2 double count years. That means we get 92 official years and 90 actual years. On the other side, in Israel, we end up with 98 official years and 90 actual years, because all of this is reckoned in that non-ascension year reckoning. So where does that leave us? Well, we've got the basics right now. We've nailed down. We know Solomon ruled for 40 years, so we now know he reigned 970 or 971 to 930, 931. That is established. We've got the key events linking to Shalmaneser to get the rest of the early history. But now let's look at the other events to get us to the late history. We have another a stela, basically a rock monument that indicates that Jehoash paid tribute to Adad-Nirari III. But we don't have a particular date in his reign. We just know that it happened. So those two must have been alive at the same time. We also know that Menahem paid tribute to Pul. Now, Pul, as it turns out, is a nickname for Tiglath-Pileser III. And Thiele goes through that in his book, establishing that, but we'll just take that for granted. So we have Menahem paying tribute to him. And that we can establish, and again, Thiele in his book lays out the details, that was in 743. Next up, we know that in 723, Shalmaneser V conquers Samaria after a 3-year siege. So we know that's the end of the reign of the last king of Israel, which is Hosea. And again, that's 723. Sargon II, the next Assyrian king, actually claims that victory. He doesn't come to the throne until 2 years later. It was common for kings to claim particularly the late accomplishments of their predecessors. I would also suggest that I don't know, I don't have any data to say that this is or isn't true, but it may be that Sargon was actually present as a military leader, even though not king at that event, and so he wanted to take credit for making it happen once he was actually established as the king. Sargon was actually Shalmaneser V's brother. They're both the sons of Tiglath-Pileser III, and Sargon came to the throne in a coup over his brother, so definitely wanting to one-up him would be expected. But so we have that date established. The next date that we can establish through a synchronism is in 701. And here we know that Sennacherib besieged Jerusalem. It was in the 14th year, I believe, of Hezekiah. We know that to be 701 BC, that actually took place in the Assyrian annals. And not only is that recorded in the Bible, but it's also recorded in Herodotus in Book 2, Chapter 141, or Section 141. There's some other events that we can also tie back to. We know that Josiah was slain by Pharaoh Necho when he met him in battle. And we can tie that to a trip of the Egyptian king up to face the Babylonians in 609. So we can tie down the end of Josiah's reign. And then finally, we know that Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem in 586. So those are our key points that we need to make sure our history lines up with to be confident that we've got everything right. So now if we look from 800 down to 700 BC, that first milestone, Jehoash, doesn't really help us much, because you'll see there's a huge overlap between those two kings. We don't have anything to specify what year of reign it was for Adad-Nirari III. It's not mentioned in the Bible, so it could be anywhere, as you see with the arrows left and right, as to when that actually happened. The next event, Menahem, now that one we can tie down again to 743, so basically the very end of Menahem's reign, before he was succeeded by Pekahiah. And then the last event that we have, the destruction of Samaria, we know that's the end of Hoshea. So if we put all these pieces together, recognizing the co-regency between Jehoash and Jeroboam II, and the competing reigns of Menahem and Pekah, we get to exactly 723 BC. So all of that works out, and we can be confident that we've got everything lined up correctly. On the Judah side, there's sort of not much going on other than the synchronisms between Israel and Judah that you see, as every king switches in one kingdom or the other. You'll see that, so-and-so began to reign in the whatever year of the other king. One thing, by the way, to remember about that is as those happen, the reckonings are in the system of the king that is being referred to. So if it says in Israel, a king of Israel began to reign in, say, Jeroboam II began to reign in a certain year of Amaziah of Judah, that's based on how Israel reckons those dates. And similarly, the other way, if Amaziah began to reign in a certain year of Jehoash, that's based on how Judah reckons those dates. And so in the end, in the period we're actually looking at, where they're both reckoning dates using ascension year, then it doesn't matter. But in the earlier period, that does matter, and that's another thing that can get you off in terms of your years. So the one event that we have here is, of course, 14th year of Hezekiah. That is 701 BC, and we have Sennacherib besieging Jerusalem. So that's our basic 800 to 700, the end of Israel. There's a couple other things that happen here. The beginning of the way we would reckon time. The Greeks reckon from the first Olympiad, so they would reckon Olympic cycles every 4 years. And you could say, hey, in the 10th Olympiad, which would be 40 years, in the second year of that Olympiad, which would make it 42 years. And that would allow you to date from 776 BC. Rome just reckoned from the date that Rome was founded, 753 BC. So you'd say, hey, in the 200th year of Rome, well, that would be 553 BC. And so that helps us to get to more exact dating. Unfortunately, we're not dealing with either Greece or Rome as we try and establish these dates. We're back to Assyria, Babylon, and then Egypt. And this doesn't really help us, but it's very useful for chronologists trying to establish as these other kingdoms interact with Greece and Rome to get those dates right. And so the closer we get to Jesus, as we go from BC to AD, the tighter those dates get because we have the absolute dating. All right, so let's talk about the last years of Judah. We have, there's a passage in Chronicles. We know Manasseh was a bad king, did not follow the Lord. And at some point, he is put in chains and taken away by the king of Assyria. He repents and is restored to his throne in Judah, which I think is why we don't see a co-regency starting there. We don't know when that happened, but I'm going to propose that that was 664 BC. The reason for that is in 664, Ashurbanipal came from Assyria and went down and sacked Thebes in Egypt. He would have had to pass through Judah, both coming and going. And so he had a great opportunity there if he wanted to throw Manasseh in chains. It was sort of on his way. Now, it could have happened under Esarhaddon before, or it could have happened later. But to me, this is probably the most likely date, but I put it up there with a question mark because there's nothing to tell us that that was in fact when it happened. So we can continue now with Egypt and Judah. Again, we come to Necho killing Josiah. Now, what's happening here is there's a major shift taking place in these late years in the power system in Israel. In the early years, Egypt is really the major foreign power, and that continues to some extent right up until this point with Necho. But you'll see with Israel paying tribute to Assyrian kings that Assyria ultimately really established themselves as the major power in the north. Ahaziah or Uzziah was known from some inscriptions to be a major factor in an alliance of kings that opposed Assyria. So that may have been with support from Egypt, or just kind of a bunch of kings banding together, just not wanting to allow Assyria to get more powerful. But you kind of have Assyria in the north, Egypt probably still showing some influence in the south. And here after Thebes is sacked, you get a new dynasty on the throne. Egypt makes a little bit of a comeback. And so at the same time, now you have the rise of Babylon. And what happens is Assyria has been running Babylon for a while. In 620 BC, Nabopolassar, king of Babylon, rebels against Assyria. Babylon becomes an independent kingdom. In 612, Babylon, with a coalition that included the Medes, so we'll hear about the Medes later, they destroy Nineveh. So Nineveh is the capital city of Assyria. The Assyrian Empire doesn't quite end there because they still control another major city, which is Haran, the same Haran that we hear about in Genesis with Abraham and his father Terah. But basically a general name who takes the name as a king is Assur-uballit II. Assur-uballit is a king from much earlier, the first. He continues to be king of Assyria for 3 years. And in 609, he enlists the help of the Pharaoh now, who they had been in conflict with Egypt. Now he goes and enlists the help of Egypt to support him in a fight against Babylon to try and retake parts of the Assyrian Empire. And they lose that battle. So they're defeated by Nabopolassar and the Babylonians. That is the end of the Assyrian Empire in 609. Not the end of Egypt, though. Pharaoh Necho is still very powerful, has a big army. So what we see is another battle, which takes place in 605, known as the Battle of Carchemish. It's mentioned in Jeremiah 46. This is an interesting one. Nabopolassar is still alive at this point. He is sick, though. He stays home in Babylon. His son Nebuchadnezzar II leads the army to victory at Carchemish, basically breaks the power of Egypt in Palestine, or is the Israel area, Palestine, Syria, Lebanon. That now becomes the dominion of Babylon. The Egyptians are driven back to Egypt. And shortly after that battle, Nabopolassar dies. Nebuchadnezzar runs back to Babylon, gets crowned king, and then we have his actions after that. So now Babylon is the major power. So they come to Jerusalem in 597 and do the first deportation, which starts the first captivity. So if we look at the kings of Judah, we had Manasseh, succeeded by Ammon, succeeded by Josiah. Josiah is killed by Pharaoh Necho. People put his son Jehoahaz on the throne, but Necho, on his way back from the battle, deposes Jehoahaz, puts his own guy on the throne, which is another son, Jehoiakim. Once Nebuchadnezzar is able to assert his power, he deposes Jehoiakim, who would have been a friend of Egypt, wants to put his guy on the throne. He takes Jehoiachin as captive, and then we're left with, actually, he puts his guy Zedekiah on the throne. And Zedekiah rules up until he rebels, and ultimately Nebuchadnezzar destroys Jerusalem in 586, and that's the end of the kingdom of Judah. So that's all the late history, but you see it's a big back and forth going on in the larger world between Assyria, Babylon, and Egypt, and Judah is kind of caught in the middle of all that. So here is our complete timeline. So we have all the kings laid out. This is what you'll see on the Biblical Timeline website in terms of this period and the key events. So I want to take a minute, though, and talk about Egypt. There is one very important synchronism that we didn't talk about, but we'll come back. We'll come to that in a second. Before we get there, briefly, 966 then is the foundation of Solomon's temple. We find this reference in 1 Kings 6:1, and the importance of that verse is it gives the years back to the Exodus from that event. So now that we've established that the 4th year of Solomon's reign is 966, we now have a date for the Exodus, and from that we can work our way back to earlier dates, in fact, all the way to creation. So that's why this is so critical. This really becomes the anchor point for all earlier chronology. And now I want to talk about Egypt. So we didn't talk about Shishak. So we know from the Bible that in the 5th year of Rehoboam, which we'll put as 925, Shishak, Pharaoh of Egypt, comes and carries away all the temple treasures. First point I want to make on this is that we don't need this synchronism to set up the calendar for Judah and Israel. You saw we did the whole thing without even bringing this up. It does not rely on that. The fact is actually that Egyptian chronology relies on this synchronism, but not the Hebrew chronology. So there are two different chronologies that use this. The first is what I'll call the Orthodox chronology. This is what most Egyptologists would accept. In the 1820s, Champollion, one of the decipherers of hieroglyphics, took his one and only trip to Egypt to prove that he could actually read the hieroglyphs, and he found in a temple an inscription from the pharaoh Shishak I, talking about a campaign in Israel. Now, the interesting thing is that campaign does, in every Egyptian campaign, it will actually list all the cities that they conquered, and none of the cities of Judah, and certainly Jerusalem, are listed as places that he conquered. So, but because of the similarity phonetically between Shishak and Shishak, Champollion said, "Aha! This is the guy. This is Shishak from the Bible." And for the last 200 years, that has been the Orthodox chronology, all built off of that synchronism. Shishak is in what we call the 3rd intermediate period of Egypt. It's a period where there was lots of confusion, and there's a lot of questions about the actual chronology, and that's why we can't just stack dates back from 664, the other date that we had. It's kind of a lot of competing pharaohs in the north and the south and other things going on. A lot of scholarly debate on exactly what the right system is to date that, and so this has been used as the basis for dating everything in Egypt before this particular synchronism. Recently, starting in the mid-1990s, a guy named David Rawl proposed a new chronology where he has Ramesses II, the most famous pharaoh in Egyptian history, actually the one that you see in the 10 Commandments and movies like that, as the pharaoh, as Shishak. Now, obviously, phonetically, Ramesses is very different from Shishak, but Rawl is able to show that Ramesses actually had a nickname, which is more like Shishih, and how that could have been corrupted into Shishak by later editors. And so he makes a case that this is Ramesses, but this is far from the accepted view. I put it out here because it's a question that I get sometime. I don't have a complete new chronology at this point. Something I'm trying to kind of put together from various references to fill in all the gaps, but he would put Ramesses there. And then that means that Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh, and also the pharaoh that's mentioned in the Amarna letters, would line up with Saul and Ishbosheth. So, and Rawl would actually equate Saul with a person from the Amarna letters called Libiah, who was a chieftain in Israel in the highlands of Ephraim at that time. Lines up in a lot of ways very well with Saul. And then he's killed in battle. His son Mutbal, which is a translation of Ishbosheth, basically the same name but translated into Akkadian, sends a couple of letters to the Pharaoh at the end. So that could be, but it doesn't fit the traditional chronology, and there's a lot of work and discussions still to be done. A lot of prominent Egyptologists would call the new chronology rubbish, but there is a lot of evidence to support at least some of the assertions that Rawl makes there. So I wanted to put it out there. But the key thing again to remember is that we don't need this synchronism to nail down the dates of the Hebrew kings. It can all be done from the Assyrian and later Egyptian and Babylonian synchronism. So we can still be confident, regardless of who Shishak is, that we have the right dates for Solomon. Okay, well, that's it. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned. There will be more of these as I have time to put them together.